N-E-G-R-O. Si un negro destaca es porque es una excepción. Un negro no es negro del todo cuando muestra educación.
In Tales of Clay, we read the short story titled The Black Man. He was target of all stereotypes because of his darkness. He's constantly thought of as less for being black and poor. His co-worker, a white man who was his boss, played a flute made of bamboo. The black man wanted to learn and was willing to pay the white man to teach him. As time went on, he surpassed his teacher's skills. The white man, surprised by the black man's ability to play the flute, was even willing to pay the black man to teach him his secrets. The black man said, "Don't think I'm selfish, my friend. It's me, my sadness, my color." Classism has always been present in societies and found implicitly and explicitly embedded in manner and forms of all people. Most of the time it gives a sense of frustration or feeling of superiority towards others. There are several reasons that can be used to divide social classes, but in the case of Mexico, this has happened because the habit is inherited for centuries and has been cultivated for generations because of the education that is passed from grandparents to parents and children. It is a serious problem that prevails in Mexico, and many people do not notice or know why so many differences, or rather, they do not know themselves that they are classist and racist. The research aimed to raise awareness about the existence of classism and racism in Mexico, since many times this is a subject rarely accepted by Mexicans. Because they think of their country as a friendly, warm, and welcoming nation with all, and in most cases, it is not. As it will be shown by the data collection, in Mexico, racism and classism go hand in hand, according to Beatriz Urias from the Social Research Institute of the UNAM, one of Mexico's most prestigious universities. The problem with these distinctions is that over time, they have been increasing and are determining employment and education opportunities, friendship groups, banning the entry to some places, etc. Turning this into a social problem that exists on a day-to-day basis, it creates a phenomenon of love for the outside and rejection of the inside. Mexicans tend to praise products, ideas, companies, personalities from abroad and minimize that of their own country to believe that it is not going to be as good. Though the black population in Mexico is a minority, it's among the most marginalized communities in which the country, with high rates of illiteracy, unemployment, and poverty, as well as being subject to discrimination and racism.
In the following video from El Consejo Nacional para Prevenir la Discriminación, we can see examples of how discrimination occurs in Mexico. In the video, we see very basic ways in which racism and classism exist in Mexico, and the ideology that people with lighter skin are superior.
¿Cómo fuiste a quedar con ese? ¿Qué no ves que hay que mejorar la raza?
Ni cruzarte la calle, ¿sabes? Pareces indio.
No me dejaron pasar al antro por ser moreno.
In the movie Mexico and Peru, The Black Grandma in the Closet, we are introduced to history of slavery, black generals leading the War of Independence, the negation of black ethnicity in the family, and the belief that black people are inferior. In the 16th and early 17th centuries, 1 out of every 2 slaves bound for the Americas disembarked in Mexico.
I asked my grandpa, why you never told me we are black? And he held my hand and told me, sweetie, we are not black, we are morenos.
A moreno.
Of course he was aware that he was a black man, but he rejected that identity.
That's interesting.
And I think this happens in most families, that you hide the black grandma in the closet.
The revolution was started by a priest named Father Hidalgo. He called for the abolition of all castes, saying Indians, mulattoes, and other castes all will be known as Americans. After he was killed, his cause was taken up in succession by 2 generals, a priest named Jose Maria Morelos and Vicente Guerrero.
In fact, both were Afro-descendants.
Wait a minute. 2 black people were generals in the War of Independence.
Yes.
So this is like George Washington being black.
Yes.
For America.
Born in Trinidad, Father Glenn Jamat has been ministering to congregations in the Costa Chica for the past 25 years.
The first occasion when I said a mass, a grown man came and he said, "Who are you?" And I said, "I am the priest." And for about 10 minutes, he went on, "You're not a priest. You couldn't be a priest. I've never seen a black priest. We black people only work the land. We load trucks and whatever.
Do you think, in your experience, they'll have a Barack Obama in this generation?
I don't think so. There's so much that has to be done before black Mexicans have access to education, political participation, social acceptance, and these things must be in place before you begin to produce leaders.
Do black people suffer discrimination here in Mexico?
Yes, we are a racist society. If you are in the cities, they stop you, ask you for your ID card, they make you sing the national anthem.
Mexico is a victim of its own success. It had a noble idea. It abolished slavery in 1830, 33 years before the United States did. But it had a romantic idea that if it eliminated racial categories, it would eliminate racism. But that was really a form of racism itself. You can't be great if you try to suppress a huge aspect of your history and a huge part of the identity of your people. If it looks like a duck, quacks like a duck, it's a duck.
The following video is from a study conducted by el Consejo Nacional para Prevenir la Discriminación. The children are asked very basic questions, but the responses are terrifying. We can also see how racism is such a big problem that national campaigns like the following have been created to prevent racism.
¿Cuál muñeco es feo? ¿Por qué?
Porque está negro.
¿Cuál muñeco se parece más a ti?
Este.
¿En qué?
Las orejas.
In the book that we read for class, Brazil on the Rise by Larry Rother, he writes about racism and classism in Brazil. According to Rother, African chattel slavery would prove over the centuries to be the worst kind of curse for Brazil. It endured until 1888, a quarter of the century after it was abolished in the U.S., and left a legacy of racism, poverty, and social discrimination, and marginalization that continues to afflict the country in the 21st century. Racial mixing became a defining trait of Brazilian culture. At first limited to indigenous South Americans, racial mixing was eventually extended to Africans as the slave trade back and forth across the South Atlantic expanded dramatically in the 17th through the 19th century. Brazilians like to think of their country as a racial democracy and have done a remarkable job of selling the idea, but the reality of race in Brazil is far more complex and ambiguous than it appears. The result is that Brazil is seen almost universally as a symbol of tolerance and cordiality. More than half of Brazil's nearly 2 million people claim African descent on census forms. Brazil's black population is not just the largest outside of Africa, but also bigger than any African country except Nigeria. Brazilians with black skin are far more likely to be killed by police than their white countrymen, earn less money, have shorter life expectancy, and have less educational opportunity than whites. Race and class are inextricably intertwined in Brazil.
Today, more than 75 million people of African descent live in Brazil, making it the second largest black population in the world.
On the one hand, it was the last country in the Western Hemisphere to abolish slavery. But on the other hand, it was also the first to claim that it was free of racism, proudly declaring itself to be a racial democracy.
10 times more Africans came to Brazil than came to the United States in the entire history of the slave trade.
That's correct.
In the coffee plantation, in the sugar plantation, weapons were not allowed, but the black people were tortured and needed a way to defend themselves. And they discovered in capoeira a way to strengthen and defend themselves.
Think about the legacy of African culture in Brazil.
What bothered them, or the biggest problem, was how to deal with the population of color. Various intellectuals believed for Brazil to become a civilized country, it had to have a process of whitening. For this reason, the government invested a great deal in European immigration to the country.
The Brazilian government paid for more than 4 million Europeans to migrate to Brazil. This was part of a process known as branqueamento, whitening. The government hoped that these new immigrants would outnumber the black people and breed with them, over time whitening the face of Brazil, both its gene pool and its culture.
Just like in our short story, blacks and minorities have proven to not be inferior. It's time to address the problem of race and class. And until Latin America demonstrates the courage to face racial problems, the myth of racial democracy will continue to flourish.